Hello, and welcome to the first in Artex's webinar series. Today's webinar is a little presentation we call Rocks in the Stream. Want to thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Bowman. I'll be walking through the different characteristics that we found studying fluid dynamics in dairy barns. So to start off, my name, again, Jeff Bowman. I'm the Eastern USA Sales Manager. I was brought on originally as a territory manager, territory sales for Artex, have been with Artex for 5 years, handled a variety of projects across the country, primarily working in the Midwest as my home territory. Big focus on ventilation for me. I've always found ventilation to be extremely interesting, intriguing, challenging, as every dairy barn is different, every situation is different. And so coming to the right solution that not only ventilates the barn correctly, but also gets the budget and the barn to meet the dairy farmer's expectations. These are challenges that you face on an everyday basis as we design barns across the US. So I've taken a real liking to it and have gotten into more of the technical side and been very curious on the fluid dynamics aspect of ventilation design. A little bit more about myself. I'm based in Northeast Indiana. I've got 2 beautiful children. My son Xander is 13. My daughter Zoe is 10. We have a lot of fun together, and they are actually the reason for the title of the slot of the presentation, Rocks in a Stream. One thing that we love to do together, we love to go down to Tennessee. It's our favorite vacation spot, and we go to the Smoky Mountains. And numerous trips down there, numerous times spent in the Smoky Mountains hiking and doing whatever. But one thing that we've found that we truly enjoyed is there's lots of mountain streams coming down out of the Smokies, lots of opportunities to go play by the water. But in a majority of those mountain streams, we found large boulders, large rocks that we can go from rock to rock and jump around on. And early on, as they were little children, I showed them how you can jump on one rock and then you jump to the next rock and you jump to the next rock, and you can actually work your way up the stream as you go, basically what we call rock hopping, bouncing around from rock to rock. And so you climb on a big boulder, you jump to the next big boulder, you jump to the next big boulder, and it's just a lot of fun for us. And one thing that my children learned was that Daddy was indestructible. Daddy would jump from one rock to the next, and if I could make the jump, they knew they could make the jump. And so Daddy would jump 2, 3, 4 feet across the water and land on the next rock. And so my kids felt brave enough to do the same. But one day, Dad took a jump that maybe he shouldn't have taken, and Dad landed on his side in the cold mountain stream, and didn't feel real good when Dad landed on the rocks either that were in the bottom of the water, and took my kids a little while to rebound from their lost confidence in Dad after that one. But it was still a lot of fun, still something we love to do. But one thing we notice as you jump from rock to rock in the stream, you notice the ebbs and flows of the water around those big rocks. You notice how water finds a pathway down the mountain that is the path of least resistance. It hits a big boulder, it hits a big obstruction, and the water finds a path around. And the path around tends to have the highest volume, tends to have the highest speed water. So the water that I landed in on the backside of a boulder was barely moving, was fairly still and calm, but the water a few feet away as it went around the big rock was moving very fast. And so that concept is something that, as we've learned more about fluid dynamics here at Artex, that concept is something that I found very relatable. I think of these mountain streams that we love to play in, and I think about, where does the water go? What happens to the current of the water? Where does the water recirculate to after it goes around the rock? Does it just refill the space and regain the volume and the width that it had before? Or does it stay in that narrower pathway? So the rocks in a stream is something that I find to best relate what we're going to be studying in fluid dynamics. Now, the obvious question is, should it be cows in a stream? Or obviously we're studying dairy barns, so shouldn't we just plunk a cow in the water and see what the water does to the cow? And that's at a basic level kind of what we're doing. But the cow itself is an obstruction, but there's many more obstructions in a dairy barn. And we have to figure out what those obstructions mean to the airflow in addition to the cow. And so I think when we talk about fluid dynamics, kind of the starting point for me, or the point to best understand, is how to move in water. We've all gotten into the water and then gone to chase somebody or go running down the beach. and trying to either walk through a few feet of water or trying to quickly do something in the water, we find ourselves very obstructed. We find ourselves very unable to move. That fluid body serves as resistance against us. And that concept of that fluid body is relatable to a dairy barn. The air inside of a dairy barn is technically a fluid body. Air all around us is a fluid body. As the molecules, as the air interacts with surfaces, it interacts as a liquid. It is a body of air. And even though it is far less dense than water, even though air doesn't have the constraints of gravity that water does, air still, as it interacts with the surface, interacts the same. So when we think about the dairy barn and we think about how to get air through the dairy barn, we have to think like Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the world's best swimmers, obviously won a lot of Olympic gold medals, but he's very good at getting through the water without being stopped. Just like you and I can't get in the water at the beach and run through the water, Michael Phelps has figured out the most clean, most efficient way to move his large body through the water. Obviously, he's got some flippers for hands and is obviously able to propel himself extremely well. And so that's why he's the fastest. But half of being a good swimmer is the aerodynamic aspect. How do we pull ourselves through the water with the least amount of obstruction? So that's the gist of what CFD is. CFD is computational fluid dynamics. It is the study of liquids and gases interacting with surfaces. And obviously it's been around for a long time. I think as we all look at this airplane image, we can get a pretty basic understanding, and we're all pretty relatable to the automotive industry, where we put cars in wind tunnels and then we study how does the car cut through the air, cut through the wind. Obviously they do this with airplanes. I mean, that's why we're able to hop on an airplane and fly, obviously outside of COVID restrictions and the crazy world we're living in now. The reason airplanes can fly is because we've studied how the air interacts with that plane. And we've learned the best way to make air move under and over that wing to create the lift that we need to get planes up in the air. And that's exactly what CFD is. And the fun part is we're going to relate it to dairy barns. CFD is a ton of calculations where the computers, our computer that performs our CFD at Artex is a massive computer, and it takes hours and hours and hours to generate a CFD image because the computer has to analyze so many interactions, so many points where the air hits a surface and then what happens. So on a large aeronautical automotive scale, those computers are huge when they're doing these studies and those interactions. Obviously at Artex, we're not nearly that advanced. We don't have a supercomputer, but we do have the ability to study and figure out what's happening in these dairy barns. So how do we apply those airplane or automotive principles to dairy? And I think number one, you look at the cow, you look at the image of the body of the cow, and we figure out what's she going to do to the air inside the barn. I mean, so let's go to cows in a stream. What's she going to do? What's going to happen when that air hits her in a dairy barn? Are we going to get the air on her that we want? Is the air, as it passes around one cow, going to go to the next cow? And just looking at this image here, you get a real basic understanding of she's standing in an alleyway, she's standing obstructing air moving through a tunnel barn. What happens to that air? And obviously your color scheme here is some of your fastest moving air. Your reds are fastest, your blues are slowest. And so as we see that air going from top to bottom on your screen, we see that air coming and hitting her nose. We see her nose obviously being an obstruction and blocking a certain amount of air. But as that air passes beside her, look at your reds and your oranges. Look how we've accelerated that air because it hit an obstruction and went around. Just like the rock in a stream analogy I was giving you, where the boulder sits in the way, the fastest water is to the sides of the boulder because we've blocked it, we've pushed it aside, and so now we've created more volume and more current to both sides of that boulder. That's what's happening to her. But then look at the ebb tide on the back of her. Look at that blue space where the water has gone around, but it didn't just immediately collapse. It didn't just immediately regain its momentum at the backside of the cow and keep going. The air stays in the space that it was given. It's pushed off to the side, so the air doesn't immediately just re-collapse on the backside of the cow and regain the momentum it had. It stays in the path that it was in. This is a critical piece of information for us to understand as we look at dairy barn design, as we look at ventilation design. I think because we don't see air and we don't see what air is doing, we just all make the assumption, well, air is everywhere, air fills every space. So when the air goes around the cow and accelerates on the sides of the cow, it'll just refill the space behind the cow, no problem. But just like a car with its wind shadow, just like the wind tunnel design, that air doesn't just go right back behind her and gain speed. This is what we need to better understand. When we look at the air movement around her, this video is excellent imagery. Your colors are reversed as far as air speeds. Your reds are now your lighter colors, and your blues are now your faster colors. So you got to inverse your thinking a little bit, but we get the concept. The air hits her head, and then that space on the backside of her head and along her neck is now a absent space of air. It's now a space where the air did not recollapse. The airspeed stays above her. And then look at the back of her body, same thing. When you look at her tailbone down to her udder, what we have done is we have blocked all of that air from passing behind her. And so now our fastest air speeds are below her and above her. This is critical understanding for a dairy barn, because one thing we struggle with in dairy barns is that the air is always up high. The air is always above your head. The air is always trying to carry. In a dairy barn, we're always trying to get that air back down. And this is a real basic video imagery as to why. When we see what she does to that air, it's easier to keep traveling up high and up above her where there is no obstruction. And so we put a couple of these cows in a line. If you take this video image and you put one behind it and then another one behind it, what happens to that air as these cows go in line and go in sequence? It all goes up. Even as you look at the video and you look underneath her, which there's no blockage underneath her in this video, but look at how narrow those bands of fast air are at the floor, where again, it's still just so much easier to push air up above her. Zero restriction. The air doesn't have to interact with the floor up high. It just continues to travel. And then here's a still image of that same concept. And again, back to the reds and the blues, blue being slow, red being fast. Look at the air up above her head. Look at what we've done with that massive obstruction of her body. We've pushed the highest velocities and the highest speeds up above. And down at the bottom, where we have a struggle to pinch some air underneath that cow, you see the slowest speeds. And obviously back behind her, going back to the let's put 2-3 cows in a row. So if you go to the end of that blue and you add another cow, the exact thing you're going to see is that air does not get back in between the cows. It either stays up or it stays down, with zero air going back in front of the second cow in line, the third cow in line. That's the challenge of dairy barn design, is we want to ventilate these cows, we want to cool these cows, but they themselves serve as the obstruction. They themselves serve as the one thing that blocks the air from getting through. Now this image here is obviously not a dairy barn, but I like it because to me it represents that rocks in a stream mentality. This is obviously just a tube dynamic where we're pulling air through this tube system, and we're asking it to turn and curl and do lots of interactions, which is what we see in a dairy barn. In my mind, you look at those large polygons in the center, and to me, those are representative of rocks in a stream. Those are representative of the obstruction that I mentally go to when I think of how is air going to travel around, how is water going to travel around an object. And so you see in this illustration, you see the red being the fastest moving on both sides of that obstruction. And we see it kind of block, we see it come back together, we see it get blocked, we see it come back together. But look at the side tabs, look at those little triangles as you follow this tube through. The triangles on either side, those serve as a restriction on the backside of these rocks in the middle of the stream. That rediverts the air back to the center, rediverts the water back to the center, which is great. But look at in between those triangles on the walls. You don't see any airspeed. You don't see any return to volume, any return to velocity on either side of this tube. To me, that's extremely telling. That is exactly what we fight in a dairy barn, is that once you block the air, once you push the air center, once you push the air away from the obstruction, it doesn't refill the empty space. The velocity never returns to the empty space. That's the challenge we have to overcome in a dairy barn, is how do we get air back into those difficult spaces? How do we get around that obstruction, get the air to redivert and come back through? To me, this image is very telling of what we need to understand. This isn't a dairy barn. This isn't anything practical to what we do on a daily basis, but this image is a perfect representative of what we fight as we try to push air into places it doesn't want to go. How do we get the air pushed back to the center? How do we get the air pushed back to the sides? The challenge of pulling air through a tunnel. So let's get real practical on a dairy barn. What do we see? What are we going to do when we start pulling air through this dairy barn? This is a tunnel ventilated barn. Let's imagine we're pulling air from the far side with the doors, as we see the doors, to the side that we're at. What's the air going to want to do? Where's the air going to go? Where are the rocks in the stream, and where are the riverbeds? Where is the fast moving velocity as a result of this? So again, going to that end wall with the barn doors. In a perfect world, we have a curtain end wall on a tunnel barn so that we can have a nice wide opening to pull air through. Unfortunately, in some realities and some real dairies that have been built, we have to work with what we're given, and what we're given may be all these doors in the end. Well, if you look at where those doors sit over alleys, those doors sit over unobstructed areas. The stalls, the stem walls, the cows are in the white space that you see in the top image. And so if we're going to pull air through those doors, where will it distribute? And then where the obstructions are, will we ever get air back into the cows? I think any challenge to a tunnel ventilated barn, and this is a great slide that shows exactly what happens when we do a tunnel ventilated barn and we're trying to get airspeed pulled through a tunnel. Air pulls into the tunnel where it says inlets on both sides in that middle image. This one's a little unusual because we're pulling air through the sides of the barn rather than through the end of the barn. But in theory, that should help us keep the air in the stalls, right? In theory, that should pull the air out to the sides and keep it distributed to the edges of the barn. But in reality, air does exactly what water does in that riverbed. Air goes into the path of least resistance. As soon as that air gets sucked in, if you look at the top image and you see where it says inlets and then it says B, in between that space, that air has interacted with those stalls, that air has interacted with the stem wall obstructions and has done exactly what we know a tunnel barn to do, pushed all the air to the center. And this is extremely telling because then you look down towards the C in the middle image, you look down towards the sidewalls in the middle image. Does the air ever go back out to the stalls? Does the air ever go back out to the cows? And it doesn't. It stays in that feed lane because that feed lane is what we know to be the path of least resistance. That feed lane is zero obstruction. So one challenge I have is when I'm working with a dairyman and we're standing in the feed lane and he's saying, well, look at my barn ventilates so great, feel how fast this air is. And we're standing in the feed lane dealing with 7 mile an hour, 8 mile an hour air. And that's great. However, the cows are standing over in the stalls. And if we're looking at this image, we know exactly what kind of airspeed and what kind of air movement those cows are getting. We're standing in the feed lane and we're perfectly content with what we're getting. The cows are getting almost no air. The cows are getting typically half the airspeed that we're getting in the feed lane. And in certain cases, they're actually getting less. So this image is a very educational image and something that I like to show dairy farmers and say, hey, okay, here's your tunnel, but is this what you want to ventilate? Do you want your air to be all going down the feed lane? Is the feed lane going to make you money if it's got fast moving air? I think we all know the answer is no, but we have to put it in an image that the gentleman can understand. This is another tunnel barn, different image. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at simply the obstruction of the stem walls. This doesn't take into account loops. This doesn't take into account other obstructions. Just simply look at what stem walls do. And so you've got your fast moving air. Your fastest moving air here is it's identified as 8.95 miles an hour. And that fast moving air is exactly on both sides of the obstruction. That fast moving air is going around the rock and accelerating, creating velocity. But as it goes around the rock in the stream, you look behind the stem walls, and the velocity that we're seeing there is 4.47 miles an hour. Just that one obstruction alone. This doesn't take into account a feed lane. This doesn't take into account building columns. This doesn't take into account cows and loops. That one obstruction alone creates a 1-to-2 ratio on airspeed. And I think that's, again, very telling. This is just a small part of what we fight in a dairy barn to get airspeed. And yet here we are looking at this one small obstruction is enough to make the airspeed cut in half where we want it to be. And then this is a slice of that same barn, taking into account the loop and then giving you a snapshot image of that airspeed in that barn. And again, red being fastest, blue and your greens being slower. Where is there no obstruction? Where's the path of least resistance? It's completely to the alleys. It's completely around the stem walls and around the loops. And here we are looking at all the airspeed being not in the beds, not cooling the cows. This is a barn we did down in Tennessee. It's a Sweetwater Dairy, and we did this modeling image for them. We have a sketch it capacity in our engineering department, and so we're able to 3D model some barns. Gives us a much better image of what we'll be looking at when the barn is built. Gives us some talking points with the dairymen, and just gives them a really good visual of what they'll be seeing in their barn when it's complete. I know some people have trouble taking things from plan view to three-dimensional view in their minds. And so this gives a really good snapshot to the dairyman. How do you want this to look? How do you want the barn to turn out when we're finished? And obviously very easy to move things on paper before the barn is built. But this barn was designed and built as a tunnel ventilated barn. And so we did the SketchUp model to look at, okay, where are your obstructions going to be? Where do we want to put fans? Obviously, this being a tunnel barn, one conversation is we want to put circulation fans in to create airspeed in those challenging spots. And you look in this image, and in the center of the image is the robot rooms that are in an L shape on the opposite side. That's part of their design. That's probably how they wanted to do the barn for cow flow. But if you look at those robot rooms, and in this next image, as we're looking down the view of the barn, the image is mirrored, so your robot rooms are now on your right. You look at what that robot room does as an obstruction in this path. You look at what that robot room is going to accomplish in terms of pushing air away. We already know what the stem walls are going to do from previous images. We already know what the loops are going to do from previous images. Now we've put this big giant box right in the path of where we want to ventilate. So actually going back, I want to look at this image again. If you look at the stalls behind those L-shaped robot rooms, and you look at the orientation of those versus the orientation of that robot room, what do you expect to happen to those cows in that space behind the robot room? They're not going to see any air at all. And this is where we start talking about, where do you place circulation fans? How do we redistribute air? How do we fight the path least resistance of the feed lane and actually push that air back to where the cows can use it and feel it? So going back to the tunnel ventilated barn, and so now we're looking at a more of a plan view, more of a section view that lets us see what's actually going to be in the barn. And obvious is we got the loops now. We have the loops added in, and that's going to push some air around. We have building columns. And building columns can stratify air. Building columns serve as an obstruction that's going to push air to either side. So we start to see some obstructions looking down this plan view. But going back to one of our major obstructions, and also what we want to ventilate, let's start putting some cows into the space. Just that cow alone, look at how much air she's impeded in that space. What we have to think about this barn as is a section of pipe. And if that section of pipe is pulling air or pulling water through it, that we're going to create a block and an obstruction in that tunnel barn, correct? Well, let's start filling the barn. Now look how many obstructions we've created. Now look how many blockages are in this pipe. Keep it going, fill that pen, and now we've got all those blockages on that side. I've got a feed lane to my left, I've got a feed lane in the center, and I've got dead air space up above those cows. So we start putting pressure to that, and we start pulling water through that barn. We start pulling air through that barn as a fluid body. Where's it not going to go? So carry that over. Now we've done the same thing to both sides of the barn. Now we've got all the obstruction in the cow space, and look at what's still open. Look at our feed lanes on both sides. Look at our feed lane down the center. Now we've created a ton of obstruction in the cow space, and now you've got a really good visual. Where's the open space, and where's the fluid, where's the water, the air going to go? Now, what I like to say is that this is not realistic of a dairyman's true stocking rate. Because a true stocking rate is going to look a little more something like this. We're not going to have a cow per stall. We're going to have a couple extra cows in there. And so you start imagining those cows milling around, you start imagining extra cows in the barn, and the obstruction has just gotten massive in the cow space. And again, going back to those alleys, going back to those unobstructed spaces, this slide gives us a good feel for air distribution through those riverbeds, through those alleys. Look at how we've sucked through, we've generated that suction to pull air through, and look at how we've spread. Look at how we've gone through different spaces. You can see your alleys at the bottom of the image, and look, and that's where we've created the airspeed. That's where the air has gone versus the blockages in the bed spaces. Moving to the next type of barn that's very common, cross fence. We got lots of cross fence in the Midwest. We have cross fence in Texas. CrossVent has become a very economical building choice because we can get so many cows into one space. We can get so many animals into one barn. We create a ton of efficiency that way. But to build a big barn and to build a CrossVent, the logic going back has been put in baffles. And what baffles do is baffles create a ceiling to the air so that the air gets pulled underneath. We're able to accelerate the air underneath, and we're able to get the air into the cow's space. Long been the thinking on baffles. Baffles and baffles accomplish exactly that. If we're looking at this image and you look underneath where the baffles are, we have 2, 4, 6, 8 baffles in this barn. This is a study that this is Artex's first study into fluid dynamics. This is a 2015 study on a barn that we built in Iowa, or a barn that we were part of in Iowa. And what we wanted to study was we wanted to study proper locations on baffles. We wanted to study baffle height. We wanted to better understand what we were recommending, rather than just take the industry norm of put a baffle at 8.5 feet and ventilate the cows. We wanted to understand why. And then we wanted to know a whole lot more about where those baffles should go for the best airspeed. We wanted to know a whole lot more about what kind of airspeed do those baffles generate. And we were also studying static pressure. Also wanted to know how much pressure we were going to put on the fans by putting in these baffles. So what we learned in this barn, and this was one of the final iterations that we did, is we learned that baffles are good for about 40 feet. And so if you have a pair of head-to-heads beside each other in a CrossVent, you need a pair of baffles, because after 40 feet, our air is starting in on the right side of the screen. You see the large, vast amount of light blue that comes in. That's our open inlet. There is no baffle at the inlet, so that open inlet comes in, fresh air comes into the barn, and spreads fairly evenly through that space, up and over the stalls to some extent, but fairly evenly through that space until we hit our first baffle. And moving from right to left, you see that where that red is, that is our first baffle, that is our acceleration point. And we see phenomenal air speeds. You're seeing up to 12 miles an hour in this iteration, as far as what's being pushed underneath that baffle. So the baffle creates great air speeds, but what we see is that after a certain amount of time, we have 2 baffles in a row there. What you see after a certain amount of space and time is you see that air loses its acceleration, and you see that air start to widen out. And so between baffle 2 and baffle 3, we have a feed lane, we have a large amount of space, and we see a big slowdown in that air. We go from 12 miles an hour in this example down to 4.5 to 5. Now, in this study, this was not a dairy design firm, so imaging the cows and imaging some of the obstructions in the barn were a little challenging. So in the real world, we do not have 12 miles an hour in this barn. So we do have to take certain realistic things into effect. And since we're doing the fluid dynamics now ourselves in-house at Artex with Dr. Mario Mandaka helping us, we're able to image cows a lot better and get more accurate imaging and more accurate airspeed predictions. But in this analogy, in this image, it still gives us a perfect example of what happens after a baffle. After a baffle, that air loses its acceleration, it expands back out, it widens back out. It doesn't ever fill the space of the baffle. It doesn't widen out to that extent. Just like in the riverbed, it doesn't fill back the entire riverbed, but it does redistribute itself out away from the concentration and gets a certain amount of spread. So in this example, we're not getting any airspeed at the feed lane. We're not getting any air movement at the backside of the headlocks. And as I'm talking with the dairyman, as I'm explaining why we do designs the way we do, one thing I want him to understand is I want him to understand when he stands in a tunnel vent barn and he stands in the feed lane and that feed lane is moving fast, that doesn't mean it's a good barn. And when we're in a CrossVent barn with baffles and we're standing in the feed lane and there's no airspeed whatsoever standing in the feed lane, that doesn't mean it's a bad barn. What we have to do is we have to get air in the cow spaces, and the expectation that I give a customer when we build a CrossVent with baffles is there will be pockets of slow moving air. The baffles are your accelerator. The baffles are your constriction that's going to pinch that air and push it into the space you want it. The downside of that being anywhere you don't pinch and constrict the air, you lose the airspeed. So that's, I guess, going to one of the next things that I struggle with on a CrossVent barn with baffles is if we're looking in between those baffles and you look in that dark blue space, you see small amounts of that light blue-green swirling through the baffles. And that small amount of swirl that we generate in those baffles, that's the small amount of turbulence that's generated after a baffle. That's going to take a certain amount of air out of that baffle, and we will be very slowly exchanging that air. But what doesn't happen is we don't have the mass exchange of air. And to me, air exchange is one of the biggest undervalued, under-talked about items as we talk ventilation in dairy barns. Air exchange and the quality of air that a cow is breathing has a huge effect on heat stress. It has a huge effect on dry matter intake. And so where I struggle with a cross-vent barn is I struggle with these pockets of dark blue that you see here, and I struggle with what's going to get that air out of those baffles. We know that that air is going to accumulate gas, it's going to accumulate heat. And so in a cross-vent barn on a 90-degree day, in between those baffles, number one, we're deteriorating the building because we're not taking those gases out. But number two, we're having a cumulative effect of there's only so much heat and only so much gas that air is going to absorb. And then a certain amount of that is not only going to work its way back down into the airstream, but it's not going to work its way up and above the cows because the airstream is through the cows. So just some challenges and some things to think about when we design a cross-vent barn with baffles. Doesn't mean a cross-vent barn with baffles doesn't work. Doesn't mean it doesn't make milk. But it does mean we need to understand where that air is. We need to understand what the expectation should be. And that's the number one thing I try to do with a dairy farmer is to educate and say, great, we'll do a cross-vent barn with baffles. Here's what I think the baffle height should be and why. Here's where you're going to be able to see some airspeed, and here's where you're not going to see some airspeed, so that we're all clear on the expectations. We're all clear that at the end of the day, when the barn is built and he's holding up his air meter and he's measuring air, I want him to know what he's going to get. And I think by doing the CFDs and by doing the studies, we at Artex have a much better concept on what is going to move that air where we want it. And we have a much better concept on what the dairyman can expect. And I think, number one, creating those expectations, and then number two, meeting those expectations, that's a huge difference in whether the barn was a success or not a success. If you have unrealistic expectations and you want to stand in this feed lane and you want to measure airspeed just like you would in your tunnel barn, you're going to be horribly disappointed. But at the end of the day, if we get the airspeed in the beds and the milk is going in the tank, you're not going to be disappointed then. So a little bit closer up, this is a different barn that we did where we studied how many baffles could we do accelerating or decelerating baffle height. That was something interesting, where we started the baffles off at 12 foot. We dropped them in 6-inch increments as we went in the barn until we reached a final height of 9 feet. And then the 9 feet stayed as a constant. So that's what you see in this, is that we don't have a ton of airspeed. This barn's moving left to right. And so we have our inlet, we hit our first baffle. Our first baffle isn't low. So our first baffle doesn't create a ton of airspeed. But again, the thinking in this model and the thinking with this dairyman was the expectation. He wanted for those first few cows are getting the freshest air. So if they're getting the freshest air, do they need the most airspeed? And in his mind, the answer was no. So we don't have as much airspeed at those higher baffles. As the baffles get shorter, we start to generate the airspeed. The air is less fresh as it goes through the barn. We need to have more airspeed to cool those cows with. And the main thinking here was, are we going to reduce the static pressure? Because we're not hitting that first baffle and creating a massive constriction, but we're slowly constricting the air. Are we going to reduce the static pressure of the barn? In our modeling, we found that we were reducing the static pressure of the barn roughly 0.08, which was fairly significant considering that this is a fairly large barn, and we were getting concerned that we were going to be seeing static pressures in the 0.25, 0.27 range. If we can get the static pressure down below 0.2, well, consider that a success, because that's less pressure on the fans, less work that the fans have to do to perform. So this barn is still being built, so we still have to test this in real life against the modeling, but I think it's going to be a very interesting barn, very interesting build. I think the other thing that we find interesting is you look at the lower image and you see all the swirls that I mentioned in the last barn. As we slowly reduce baffle height, when we reach that plateau, or we reach that lower baffle height as a constant, now we see a massive amount of swirl. I believe that's because we have taken a large amount of volume and we have pushed it into a smaller space. And then at that point, the balancing that the pressure is going to create, going from large going to small, the balancing of the pressure is what created that swirl. Similar to when, again, going back to the riverbed illustration, when water goes around multiple obstructions, get pushed into a very small space, what you'll sometimes see is a rotational swirl behind the rocks as that pressure balances itself back out. That's what I think we're seeing in the middle of this barn. And again, going back to the cross vent, looking a little more closely, looking at those air speeds. Again, high acceleration at the stalls, and then up and over the feed lane, slow down, and you see the gap between the floor and the fast moving air at the feed lane. I think that's very telling of what we see in a cross vent barn. And again, looking at the swirl is that air gets pinched at the baffle, and you see that small amount of rotation of the baffle. Very critical to understand, very critical to get some air flowing underneath the roof line, so that we make sure we don't have gas and moisture sitting on the purlins and on the roof structure. The more gas we leave in the barn, the more that barn is going to deteriorate over time. So again, keeping in mind the massive financial investment of building the barn, we got to make sure we protect that barn. And so we need to understand how to move some air underneath the purlins to keep those from deteriorating quickly. One study we did was in placing baffles. We had a dairyman who wanted to do the fewest number of baffles possible. And so we played with where could they be placed, how far apart could they be, and what would be in his mind the acceptable airspeed and acceptable return. Now, from a baffle standpoint, because baffles do create that blockage, and we don't get the air circulation as much as I would like in between the baffles. The idea of doing fewer baffles intrigued me, and we would like to do that. In my mind, the less baffles we can build a barn with, the better we're going to be. But in this case, we played with going from 3 to 4 to 8 baffles. Your air inlets in these images, your air is inletting on the right, and your air is exhausting on the left. So you see in your top image, you see the large, long space of slow moving air until we hit that first baffle. And in the 3 baffle example, what you see is that massive release of air after it comes through the baffle. It's almost getting pulled into a serpentine pattern because we're challenging the air so much, essentially. We're letting it free flow for so long, then we pinch it. It recoils, pulls back, and then it gets pinched again. And so we ended up with a serpentine pattern in here. We're not going to ventilate a cow in that barn. We're not going to cool a cow in that barn. We're skipping over multiple head-to-heads. That's not the ideal design. Looking down at the next one, placing the 4 baffles, and you see a couple different locations on the 4 baffle placement. We get a little better. We get a little more consistent on where we're hitting cows and where we're not hitting cows, but you still see the large amount of swirl, and you still see the large amount of space that doesn't get ventilated properly because of the pinch points and the gap between the pinch points. So where we settled on this barn, going to the 8 baffle design, again, fewer baffles in my mind is better, but consistency is key. And so when we do 8 baffles in this same barn, you see a much more consistent airstream. You see much more consistent air speeds. And so at the end of the day, that's what we ended up recommending to the farmer was the 8 baffle design. As you can see, in the majority of the stall spaces and the majority of the cow housing areas versus feed lanes, we see a good current of airspeed. We see that air being pulled through and moved through the stalls where we want it to be. We see slowdowns at the feed lanes, and that's acceptable in my mind. Again, feed lanes don't make us milk. Looking at that same design and that same placement, we actually looked at the different baffle heights as well. Something we still play with here at Artex is what is the ideal baffle height. What we know is that lower baffles create more pressure, higher baffles we have less pressure, but where's the airspeed going to be to the cows? So looking at this design, we have baffle opening height along the bottom. We have total pressure, or the static pressure inside the barn, on the left. So what we found with the 3 baffle design is that the pressure was, as we expected, highest at 8 foot, highest at your lowest baffle. Your pressure was least at the 14-foot baffle. But what we found was surprising is just how consistent that was across the 3 and 4 baffle designs and across the 8 baffle designs. So what we found was that having fewer baffles didn't necessarily decrease pressure. We still had the same pinch points in the barn. And so that baffle opening height, and as we already knew, the higher the baffle, the less pressure. So this was a good little analogy, or a good little side study on that same barn we just did. Again, going back to is fewer baffles better? In this case, I'm going to say no. The 3 baffle design creates nearly the same static pressure as the 8 baffle design. So we didn't really get ahead in this case, just because we continued to repinch the air, we continued to recreate static pressure. And then looking at that in terms of air speed, that same study and that same graph, now putting it in an airspeed situation, what we see in the top graph is you see very inconsistent air speeds across the barn, across the cows. And from the 8 baffle height, basically being the most inconsistent, but having the high airspeed spots and then the low airspeed spots, what we found is the 8 foot baffle with the 3 baffle design just made a mess of the airspeed. In your middle, you have the 4 baffle design. Again, very inconsistent airspeeds. We're up and we're down. We're not hitting every cow consistently and evenly. What we found in the 8 baffle design, we got more of the consistency that we were after. We got more of the airspeed that we were after. We do dip in airspeed outside of the baffles, which is to be expected, but the majority of the stalls and the majority of the locations got the cow cooling airspeed that they needed. One other barn design that we've looked at and talked about with the CFD analysis is the new positive pressure style design. Dr. Gordy Jones has essentially invented this up in Wisconsin, has designed a few barns this way. And the concept is that we blow the air in rather than suck the air out. Sidewalls are filled with fans. As you see on both sidewalls, we're pushing the air into the center. The idea is that the center ridge is your outlet. So as the air gets pushed in towards the cows, it exhausts out the top of the barn. What we wanted to study in looking at this design was, number one, we wanted to study fan placement and angle. So we did multiple iterations with the fans further apart or closer together. We did multiple iterations with the fans at different angles to make sure that we got the most concentration of air on the stalls, but also some residual airspeed on the feed lane. We didn't want to have too much airspeed on the feed lane. The concept is to still be able to soak in this barn, so you don't want to push that water directly onto the feed. So we played with those designs and played with the proper angles, which was fairly basic. The other thing that we wanted to understand is we wanted to understand how big should that ridge opening be. That ridge opening, as designed in Gordy's first barn, was 3 foot. In talking with Gordy, we knew and he knew that 3 foot opening wasn't releasing quite enough pressure. So what we wanted to accomplish with this imagery was, should that ridge opening be 3 foot? Should that ridge opening be 4 foot? Should that ridge opening be 5 foot, based on the amount of air that we were blowing in? What we found was that the pressure release was basically peaked or plateaued at 4 foot. 4 to 4.5 foot, we had the proper amount of pressure release, where we weren't inflating this thing like a balloon. We had the right amount of air space or the right amount of opening to allow that air to escape. What we found is that the 5 foot opening, which is a pretty big opening for an overshot ridge like you see here, that the 5 foot opening, we didn't see any additional pressure release. So it left us that with this design, with the amount of air we were blowing in, 4 to 4.5 was the right design. The other thing we were able to look at was kind of the air patterns, the air sprays, if you will. The air sprays allow us to kind of determine where that air will be heading, how much air will be getting back into the stalls, how much air will be getting to the feed lane, and what those air sprays mean in terms of cow cooling. Just a kind of a fun little thing to see as far as the design and with looking at fan angles. What is the residual air when you're not directly in the path of the fan? Something fun for us to look at. The last slide to look at here was predicting the winter air speeds. So one other thing that we do talk about as we do a power ventilated barn is we want to talk about getting the right amount of air exchange in the winter, getting that air to come in the right place, but not having a huge concentration of cold air that freezes up your first alley, that gets cows sick by bringing cold air quickly across their noses. So the other thing we studied, and this is the 2015 study of the barn in Iowa, is we studied opening the curtain. So all the way on your right is the inlet of the barn, and at the top of the curtain opening, we played with that size of the gap to get the correct airspeed. What we actually wanted to do in this case is we actually wanted to accelerate the air. We wanted to bring it in fast, so it comes in high and it mixes, rather than come in and immediately drop to the alley. Cold air has a tendency to drop, and so in this case, we didn't want it to just come down, hit the alley, freeze up that first alley, and then pull its way through the barn. So we played with the opening height. We played with how open should that curtain be, what's the right amount of pressure to bring that air in quickly, allow it to mix and spread before it hits a cow, before it gets to the first baffle. And so that's what this was. And as you can see, we do get some good airspeed at the curtain. We do get that air spread. And then as it hits the first baffle and then comes across the cows, we aren't dealing with high air speeds. We're dealing with something over a mile and a half an hour. So just a gentle breeze to change out that air and cool out that air so we don't get wet noses with cold air. We don't get sick cows. So again, just another application where the CFD allows us to look at, in this case, the rock in the stream is the inlet curtain. And in this case, we're trying to do kind of the opposite, where we're trying to make it move quickly in the space above the cows rather than the space on the cows. So the CFD just allows you to do some really neat things. And then the last thing we'll talk about is on May 29th, we do have our next webinar coming up. My coworker, Sue Hagginson, will be giving a presentation on what aren't you seeing? Troubleshooting in dairy barns. She's got a very analytical eye. She's got a great background in managing dairies and in viewing dairies. So as she's worked at Artex, she's done a great job of helping customers figure out some of their problems in their barns and figuring out what's creating those problems. I think it'll be an interesting webinar with Sue. So if you're able to tune in on May 29th, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, it'll be an interesting webinar that I think you all should catch. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've learned a little bit something. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and look forward to tuning in the next time.